Hello, this is going to be a review of Unit 3. I know Unit 3, a lot of us were glad to be done with it, but I wanted to create this review video, or I suppose a collection of videos, so that way we have in the back of our brains these concepts that we've spent a lot of time interrogating and relating to one another as we undertake probably the second most difficult unit in AP Microeconomics, which is Unit 4, Imperfect Competition. This is probably the most difficult unit in microeconomics, so I know a lot of you want to leave it behind, but I want to review it and make sure that it doesn't leave your brains because you're going to need it for Unit 4. So here we started off Unit 3 by talking about production functions, and we said, similar to functions that you've seen elsewhere, production functions tell the story about inputs and outputs. And so the inputs in this production function, labor and capital, are, of course, the factors of production that we've talked about in Unit 1. This is a rather simple production function where we only assume two inputs, but we can also think about land and human capital, etc. And for our purposes, this distinction becomes super important, and for our analysis as well, it becomes very important. Short run and long run, we're going to say that in the short run, the factors of production are, one factor of production is fixed, at least one factor of production, and in the long run, all factors of production are variable, meaning can be easily changed. Or changeable, I should say, not necessarily easily changed. And then we said one of the phenomenon, and these are going to represent short-run production curves that we're going to see right here. One of the phenomenon that we expect to see in the short run is diminishing marginal returns. And the law of diminishing marginal returns says that in the short run, right, in an environment in which you hold one factor of production fixed and the other is variable, incremental gains in output or marginal returns will eventually decrease, right? So this term marginal is important, right? And the reason why marginal returns are going to decrease is because in the short run, in short run production functions, you're going to experience diminishing marginal product. This term marginal, I said that you are going to go away from AP Microeconomics, so tempted to use this word, right, to impress other people, but I really want you to be able to use this word. That's kind of a good bellwether of whether you, were successful at kind of interrogating the concepts of AP Microeconomics. But marginal, think about using the term additional twice. The additional output, or marginal product specifically means the additional product from an additional unit of output. We said that in microeconomics, for someone to be rational, they need to think at the margins, right? That's kind of or for someone to be, rational, they have to conduct marginal analysis. We've talked about marginal analysis in Unit 1. Another feature before I get into what these curves, or sort of denoting the meaning of these curves, here's a total product of labor curve of, let's say, macaroons. My parents really kind of developed these wonderful macaroons, homemade macaroons, for my cousin's bridal shower. But just a small aside about curves, right? Go back to your pre-calculus days, or maybe in some of your calculus days or your algebra 2, algebra 1 days. A curve, unlike a line has a constant rate of change, right? It has a constant slope, right? The slope is a constant. A curve does not, right? It doesn't have a constant rate of change, right? And this should always be in the back of your head, considering we're dealing with so many different curves in this unit, right? It should kind of be at the back of your brain. So here we see a total product of labor curve. Q, or quantity of macaroons, is on the y-axis, and the quantity of labor hours is on the x-axis. You can also think of it like the quantity of laborers as well could conceivably be on the x-axis as well. but I just went ahead and put quantity of labor hours to keep it similar to your Princeton review. And then on the y-axis is output per worker here. And then we can sort of see the relationships between the total product of labor curve and the average product of labor curve, and then this marginal product of labor curve. So let's think about this phenomenon just like at an intuitive level before we think about it graphically, of diminishing marginal product. So I actually helped my parents make these macaroons at one point. I will not take credit for all of them because I did not make all of them or even close. But diminishing marginal product happens in the short run where you have fixed capital, right? So my parents have fixed capital in which they made the macaroons, and let's say they wanted to make a macaroon business, or starting to get into the business of making macaroons. We should expect them to experience diminishing marginal returns with the addition of additional units of labor. Or we should expect diminishing marginal product to kick in. Or let me articulate this a different way. As you add an additional unit of labor, at some point we should expect diminishing marginal product to kick in, meaning beyond that additional unit, additional laborer, or we can think of it beyond that labor hour, the additional product from begins to diminish. That additional product begins to diminish. Additional output begins to diminish, right? And we can think about it, right? Adding an extra person to work on macaroons in the kitchen might, help in boosting the total product from that labor. But adding a third person, maybe there might not be much for that third person to do, right? In that environment in which capital is fixed. Adding a fourth person, adding a fifth person, maybe at some point you should expect negative marginal product at some point, right? You can't add 100 people to my parents' kitchen and expect to get, increasing output, right? You should expect, quite a bit of negative marginal product. And so we can see negative marginal product in this curve, in this total product of labor curve, at the point where the slope becomes negative of this total product of labor curve, right? It becomes downward sloping, right, this curve. And we see negative marginal product of labor in this marginal product of labor curve right here as it crosses the x-axis. And so we can see the relationships between these two curves there. We can also see too, this curve right here represents the average product of labor curve. This marginal product of labor curve, it doesn't necessarily have diminishing marginal product of labor, and therefore diminishing marginal returns doesn't have to kick in right away. Maybe that second labor was really a relief for my dad. My dad was the principal one working on the macaroons. Maybe it really, really helped him, and he was able to more than double output. But that third labor, that's when you start experiencing diminishing marginal product of labor, right? And then we have a downward sloping marginal product of labor curve, right? So that's significant. And then one last special feature of this before we move on to marginal costs and marginal revenue is that we should expect the average product of labor curve, the marginal product of labor curve to intersect the average product of labor curve at its maximum, and then pull the average product of labor curve down, right? So average product of labor is just the total product divided by the labor hours. Marginal product of labor is the change in total product over the change in labor. So you can also think of marginal product of labor as essentially the slope of the total product of labor curve. And the slope isn't constant, right, of a curve. And so actually, for those of you that have taken calculus, the marginal product of labor, or the marginal product curve the marginal product function is the derivative of the total product function. But if you haven't taken calculus, then don't listen to Mr. Diaz. That doesn't matter. Okay, we'll move on to average and marginal costs and revenues in the second video.